June 23, 1944, Philippine Sea, darkness blanketed the Pacific. On the bridge of a Japanese destroyer, the night was broken only by the faint glow of red-lit gauges and the nervous shuffling of sailors at their posts. The ocean was calm, unnervingly calm, but the captains knew better. Somewhere beneath them, something stirred. In the sonar room, a young operator pressed his headphones tighter against his ears, straining to capture even the faintest ping or echo. Sweat trickled down his temple. The sea, however, spoke back with silence. No contacts, no propellers, nothing but the hum of the ship's own engines, and then chaos. Without warning, a violent explosion tore through the night. A merchant ship at the heart of the convoy erupted in flames, fire stretching skyward like a beacon of death. Moments later, another blast thundered, followed by the gut-wrenching sound of steel twisting and collapsing beneath the waves. The convoy scattered, captains shouting orders, men rushing to battle stations. Yet no enemy was seen, no torpedo wake spotted. It was as though the ocean itself had risen against them. For Japanese commanders, this was more than an attack. It was a haunting. They had prepared for submarines, trained to hunt them, built destroyers armed with depth charges designed to crush them. But on this night, nothing worked. Their sonar screens remained blank. Their hydrophones heard only emptiness. And yet, ship after ship slipped beneath the water. The question burned in their minds. How could American submarines strike with such ghost-like precision and remain utterly invisible? This was not a single incident. Time and again, across the vast Pacific, Japanese captains reported the same chilling experience. Convoys would sail with confidence, protected by escorts, only to be ambushed by unseen predators. Hours of depth charge attacks followed, but when the sea finally calmed, no wreckage of submarines ever surfaced. The Americans had simply vanished. The shock was more than tactical. It was psychological. Imagine being a captain, responsible for hundreds of lives, knowing that death could erupt from the deep at any moment, without warning, without a trace. The silence of the ocean became its own weapon, wrapping entire crews in dread. Japanese officers whispered of phantom submarines, hunters that defied logic, technology, even nature itself. Some believed the Americans had developed machines beyond comprehension, silent engines that made them invisible to sonar. Others wondered if it was strategy, some new terrifying doctrine of undersea warfare. Whatever the answer, one truth became clear. This silence was not an accident. It was engineered, deliberate, and devastating, and it was reshaping the Pacific War. But to understand how America's submarines became such ghosts of the deep, to see how they learned to hunt in silence, and why Japanese captains felt powerless against them, we must travel back to the early days of America's undersea hunters. The story of the submarine did not begin in World War II. It began in whispers, fragile, experimental, and often dismissed. During the First World War, German U-boats had terrorized the Atlantic. They prowled shipping lanes, sinking British freighters and passenger liners alike. The word submarine carried with it an aura of fear, but also of unpredictability. These undersea boats were clumsy, slow, and often betrayed by the very noise of their engines. When they struck with fury, but survival after an attack was uncertain. By the 1920s and 1930s, the world's navies looked at submarines with mixed feelings. Yes, they could be dangerous. Yes, they had proven their potential, but they were also deeply flawed machines. Consider their limitations. Their diesel engines roared on the surface, audible for miles, forcing them to run submerged only on fragile batteries that drained quickly. Their sonar and detection equipment were rudimentary, often giving as much false information as useful. Their torpedoes were unreliable, prone to misfires, duds, or running too deep beneath their targets. The submarine of the interwar years was not a predator. It was a work in progress. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, submarines were an afterthought. They were trained primarily as scouts, reconnaissance vessels that would sneak ahead of the fleet, report enemy movements, and then withdraw. Japanese doctrine believed that decisive battles would still be fought by mighty surface fleets, with battleships and aircraft carriers at the center. To them, submarines were eyes, not claws. The United States Navy, too, had an uncertain view. Its admirals were still enamored with the grandeur of battleships. To them, submarines were support craft, useful perhaps for harassing enemy warships, but hardly the backbone of strategy. American submarine crews trained diligently, But their missions were rarely envisioned as decisive. They were to shadow fleets, to test defenses, to play a supporting role in the vast chessboard of the Pacific. And yet, a small but growing number of officers saw something more. They studied the lessons of World War I carefully. They saw that one U-boat, with patience and precision, could change the course of entire campaigns by cutting supply lines, strangling economies, and forcing enemies into costly convoys. They began to ask a daring question. What if the submarine was not merely a scout, but a weapon of war in its own right? Still, by the eve of World War II, that idea had not taken root. Submarines remained imperfect, their silence broken by mechanical growls, their strikes too often betrayed by faulty torpedoes. Then came December 1941. Pearl Harbor plunged America into the Pacific War. In the chaos, U.S. submarines were unleashed, yet they entered combat with the same handicaps: unreliable torpedoes, clumsy doctrine, and commanders who were unsure of how best to wield these undersea weapons. For Japan, the war's opening years reinforced their beliefs. Submarines could scout, could harass, but they could not dominate. Convoys moved with confidence. Merchant ships sailed, believing the ocean vast enough to hide them. But war has a way of punishing assumptions. Both navies had underestimated what the submarine could truly do, and when disaster struck, when the cost of doctrine and technology became undeniable, change was forced upon them. It was here, in the crucible of the Pacific, that the submarine would be reborn. The flaws would be addressed, the silence perfected, and the hunters of the deep would evolve into something their enemies could neither hear nor escape. And soon, Japanese captains would realize, too late, that the silence they trusted was the silence that would kill them. 941. The Pacific shimmered with confidence, and it belonged to Japan. When the Empire of Japan launched its campaign across the Pacific, it did so with a navy that stunned the world. Sleek battleships, towering aircraft carriers, and destroyers bristling with weapons. This was a fleet forged with ambition and precision. To many, it seemed invincible. Their doctrine was clear. The decisive battle would be fought on the surface. Mighty battleships supported by swarms of aircraft would crush any opponent daring to challenge Japan's rise. And in the early months of the war, that doctrine seemed unstoppable. Even their torpedoes were legendary. The Type 93, better known as the Long Lance, could streak across the ocean at incredible range, carrying a warhead powerful enough to obliterate any ship afloat. Allied sailors would whisper its name with dread, for it was fast, silent, and deadly. Japan's submarines, too, reflected this philosophy of boldness. They were among the largest in the world, built to roam vast distances across the Pacific. Some even carried miniature floatplanes in watertight compartments, able to launch a small scout into the skies above remote enemy harbors. These boats were symbols of innovation and reach. Yet beneath the surface of this strength, there lurked a hidden weakness, one that would prove catastrophic. Japan had invested heavily in offensive might, but its defenses against submarines were shockingly underdeveloped. Their sonar technology was primitive, their hydrophones crude. Where the Americans and British were steadily refining their undersea detection tools, the Japanese had fallen behind. Their destroyers bristled with torpedoes, but their depth charges were often too light, too few, or set at the wrong depths to do real damage. In Tokyo's war rooms, the assumption was simple: submarines could not operate close to Japanese convoys with any success. They believed the ocean itself was too vast, too unforgiving for enemy boats to stalk them with precision. Convoys, in their view, were safe enough. It was a fatal blind spot. The irony was sharp. While Japan had mastered the art of the offensive strike, Pearl Harbor, itself a testament to that philosophy, they had underestimated the silent war that would decide the Pacific. Their admirals planned for grand surface battles, not for the invisible hunters that would strangle their lifelines from beneath the waves. But before American submarines could exploit this weakness, they first had to survive their own trials. For in the opening years of the war, U.S. submarine crews set out with determination, only to find themselves betrayed by their own weapons: torpedoes that ran too deep beneath their targets, warheads that struck hulls with a metallic thud and failed to detonate, crews who risked everything for the perfect shot, only to watch their prey escape unharmed. For the men aboard those submarines, it was maddening. They had the advantage of surprise. They had the skill. But time and again, their efforts dissolved into failure, leaving convoys untouched. And so, Even as Japan overlooked the submarine threat, America's undersea force teetered on the edge of irrelevance. Confidence wavered. Commanders questioned whether these boats could play any meaningful role in the war at all. The stage was set for a bitter irony. Japan had underestimated the submarine. And yet, in the war's first year, the submarine seemed to prove them right. But the truth was stranger, darker, and more infuriating than anyone could believe. For America's deadliest weapon was being sabotaged by its own design. January 1942. The Pacific was ablaze with war, and America's submarines, the very weapons meant to strike back, were faltering. From the very first patrols, U.S. submarine commanders faced a nightmare. Their boats were noisy, their batteries weak, but worst of all, their torpedoes betrayed them. The Mark 14 torpedo was supposed to be state-of-the-art. It had been designed in peacetime with all the optimism of American engineering, long range, a powerful warhead, and a magnetic exploder that promised to detonate beneath an enemy ship's vulnerable keel. On paper, it was devastating. In reality, it was a disaster. Patrol reports poured in, filled with frustration and disbelief. Captains risked their lives to maneuver into firing position, a task that could take hours of tense stalking, with destroyers circling overhead, depth charges ready to fall. Then, at the perfect moment, they fired and waited. What followed was either silence or worse. In some cases, torpedoes ran far too deep, sliding harmlessly under Japanese freighters. In others, they struck the target with a loud metallic clang, only to fail to explode. And sometimes they circled back in deadly arcs, threatening the very submarine that launched them. The accounts are chilling. One commander, after firing a spread of torpedoes, watched in horror as every single one either missed or failed. Another saw his torpedo strike a Japanese vessel, only for the warhead to thud uselessly against the hull, as though tapping it with a hammer. The crews could hardly believe their eyes. Imagine sitting in a steel tube, risking your life to close with the enemy, only to watch your weapons literally bounce off their target. The frustration was unbearable. Word spread quickly across the Pacific. Japanese captains, already dismissive of submarines, grew emboldened. Convoys steamed on with renewed confidence. Some destroyer commanders even joked that American torpedoes were more dangerous to fish than to ships. For the Japanese Navy, it seemed confirmation of their belief. Submarines were little more than an annoyance, but in Washington the mood was far less amused. Each failed patrol was a black mark on the Navy's pride. Political leaders demanded results. Naval Command wanted answers. Had America invested millions into a weapon that could not deliver? Tension rippled down the chain of command. Submarine skippers, the best and brightest, many fresh from the Naval Academy, were being judged not only by their bravery, but by results they could not control. Some were accused of cowardice, of failing to press the attack, when in truth their torpedoes simply refused to work. Careers were ruined. Morale sank as deep as the submarines themselves, yet the crews pressed on. Patrol after patrol, they returned with stories of near misses, of wasted opportunities, of merchant ships spared by faulty engineering. For nearly 2 years, America's undersea force struggled under this invisible weight. It wasn't just technical. It was psychological. The men began to doubt their very weapons. Every time they fired, they held their breath, not in anticipation of victory, but in dread of failure. To be a submarine captain in 1942 was to command a weapon that could betray you at the very moment you needed it most. And yet, in this crucible of failure, something else was forged. Resolve. Submarine crews grew inventive. They tested torpedoes in secret, ran experiments, risked court-martial to prove what they already knew. The Mark 14 was flawed. Piece by piece they gathered evidence until the truth became undeniable. By late 1943, the fixes began. Depth settings were corrected. Exploders were redesigned. At last, the torpedoes began to strike true, and when they did, everything changed. Suddenly, the hunters of the deep had teeth. Convoys that once sailed boldly now sailed in fear. Japanese captains who had laughed at American torpedoes now stared into the abyss, wondering if every shadow, every ripple in the sea, was a submarine lying in wait. America's submarine force, once derided as a failure, was about to become the most devastating weapon of the Pacific War. But how did they transform from bumbling to ghost-like? What secret allowed them not only to strike true, but to disappear into silence? Summer 1943. After months of frustration, anger, and bitter loss, the truth could no longer be denied. America's greatest undersea weapon had been sabotaged not by the enemy, but by its own design. Investigations finally exposed what submarine captains had long suspected. The Mark 14 torpedo, that sleek, expensive promise of destruction, was riddled with flaws. The depth-keeping system, the very mechanism meant to guide it, was broken. Torpedoes were running as much as 10 to 15 feet deeper than intended, sliding uselessly beneath their targets. The magnetic exploders, meant to detonate beneath a ship's vulnerable belly, were unstable, often triggering too early, too late, or not at all. Even the contact exploders, the simplest part of the design, sometimes failed when they hit a target head-on. It was a betrayal of trust, one that had cost lives in battles. But once the flaws were acknowledged, change came quickly. Depth settings were recalibrated. The unreliable magnetic exploder was abandoned. The firing mechanisms were reinforced. And then, for the first time in the war, U.S. submarines fired torpedoes that actually worked. The effect was immediate and devastating. Convoys that had once escaped untouched began to vanish. Japanese captains, once dismissive, now reported ships exploding in the night, tankers igniting into pillars of flame, freighters breaking apart with terrifying efficiency. In patrol zones where American submarines had once been ignored, Japanese warships now patrolled with desperate urgency, dropping depth charges at every suspicious ripple in the sea. But fixing the torpedo was only half the story. The men who commanded these boats, hardened by months of failure, had learned patience, cunning, and creativity. With their weapons now reliable, their tactics evolved into something far more dangerous. The U.S. Navy introduced wolf-pack strategies, where groups of submarines coordinated attacks on large convoys, striking from multiple angles at once. No longer was a lone boat shadowing a convoy in isolation. Now the ocean itself seemed filled with predators, each attack reinforcing the terror of the last. Training intensified as well. New commanders were chosen for aggressiveness, daring, and skill. Submarine schools hammered home the art of stealth, the patience to stalk, the precision to strike, and the discipline to vanish before retaliation. Technology, too, was refined. Radar was introduced to help submarines detect ships on the surface at night. Improved sonar gave them sharper ears beneath the waves. These tools, paired with the silent running techniques of skilled crews, made them hunters of uncanny efficiency. And so, by 1944, the transformation was complete. American submarines were no longer clumsy machines armed with faulty weapons. They were lethal predators, capable of slipping through the ocean unseen, striking without warning, and disappearing before the enemy even knew where to look. Japanese officers began to describe them with a new word: ghosts. Ships vanished without a trace, convoys scattered in panic. Even heavily armed destroyers, sent to protect merchant fleets, found themselves chasing shadows, striking only empty water. For the first time, Japan's naval command understood the scale of the threat. Their lifelines, oil from the Dutch East Indies, raw materials from Southeast Asia, supplies to their far-flung garrisons, were under siege. And the siege came not from carriers or battleships, but from the silent hunters lurking below. The torpedo fix had unlocked the true potential of the submarine. Tactics had sharpened their claws. Training had honed their instincts. Now silence was paired with deadly reliability, but there was still one question. How did these submarines, noisy machines of steel and engines, become so ghost-like, so impossible to detect? The answer lay not only in their weapons or their tactics, but in the very design of the submarines themselves. Beneath the Pacific, silence was survival. American engineers had learned a simple truth. In undersea warfare, noise is death. The clatter of machinery, the churn of propellers, the faint hum of engines, all of it could betray a submarine's presence. And so, from the very beginning, U.S. designers worked to make their boats quiet. The solution lay in the split heart of the submarine. On the surface, diesel engines roared, charging the massive batteries that powered the ship. But once submerged, the diesels shut down. In their place, electric motors took over, whispering the submarine through the water with a near-silent hum. Unlike the grinding diesels, these motors produced almost no vibration, and when crews reduced speed to a crawl, the submarine became nearly undetectable. Every detail mattered. Propellers were carefully shaped to reduce cavitation, the deadly bubbles that could give away a submarine's position. Machinery was mounted on rubber pads or isolated from the hull to absorb vibrations. Even the way the crew moved was drilled into them. No dropped tools, no careless clanging of steel against steel, not a single sound that might echo into the water. The result was astonishing. American submarines could close to within a few hundred yards of a convoy before firing, and remain unheard. By contrast, Japanese detection technology lagged woefully behind. Their sonar systems were crude, with limited range and poor resolution. Hydrophones, underwater microphones meant to catch the faint signature of a submarine, often picked up more noise from their own ships than from the enemy. Japanese destroyers would sweep back and forth, pinging the depths, but their instruments betrayed them. The Americans simply slipped past, unheard and unseen. For Japanese sailors, the experience was maddening. Survivors' accounts speak of the ocean as an enemy itself, empty one moment, exploding in fire the next. Convoys would steam in perfect formation, every ship accounted for, every escort alert. Then, without warning, the sea erupted with torpedo strikes. Ships vanished, men were thrown into the water, chaos consumed the formation. Yet on the sonar screens, nothing, no trace of the killer. One Japanese officer described it bitterly. It was like hunting shadows. We struck at the darkness with our weapons, but the darkness struck back harder. This silence did more than shield the submarines. It broke the will of those they hunted. Convoy duty became a sentence of dread. Merchant captains scanned the horizon endlessly, knowing their fate could arrive from below at any instant. Escort commanders dropped depth charges blindly, exhausting their crews and their supplies, often without hitting a thing. Psychologists would later note the toll: fatigue, paranoia, hesitation. Men began to distrust even the ocean itself. Every ripple, every wave seemed a threat. The Japanese Navy, so proud of its aggressive spirit, began to live in fear of unseen enemies. The silence was as much a weapon as the torpedo. It magnified every explosion, every loss. Convoys stopped believing they could win against the hunters. Instead, they sailed praying merely to survive. And this mattered far beyond the battlefield. Japan was an island empire, utterly dependent on resources ferried across the Pacific. Oil, rubber, tin, bauxite. The raw lifeblood of war had to move by ship. Without it, planes could not fly, tanks could not move, factories could not produce. Every convoy sunk by America's silent submarines was more than a tactical victory. It was a vein cut open, bleeding an empire slowly to death. By 1944, the effect was undeniable. Tankers bound from the oil fields of Southeast Asia burned on the surface of the sea. Freighters carrying food to Japan's home islands never arrived. The silent hunters were starving the empire from within. And yet, the campaign was only just beginning, because now, with silence perfected and torpedoes reliable, the U.S. submarine force turned its full attention to Japan's most vulnerable target, the very lifeline that kept its war machine alive. 944. The Pacific was no longer just a battlefield. It had become a silent killing ground. Japan's war machine, for all its might, was fragile at its core. The empire's industry, its planes, tanks, and ships, depended on a steady flow of resources from across the sea. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Southeast Asia, and food to feed its growing population and military. Without these supplies, Japan's power was only a shadow of its ambition. And it was here that America's submarines struck with devastating precision. They were a small force, less than 2% of the Navy, yet their impact was disproportionate. Night after night, submarine patrols infiltrated Japanese shipping lanes, stalking convoys with patience and deadly skill. Where surface ships might be met with heavy guns or aircraft, submarines relied on stealth. They could glide unseen beneath the waves, fire their torpedoes, and vanish before any response could be mounted. The toll was staggering. Merchant vessels disappeared with alarming frequency, torpedoed before captains even had time to issue distress signals. Tankers burned, freighters sank, and supply lines that seemed invulnerable were suddenly exposed. Every lost shipment tightened the noose around Japan's industry and economy. Japanese commanders could only watch in frustration. Their sonar was nearly useless against these silent predators. Depth charges dropped into empty water became a futile gesture, and destroyer escorts were forced into desperate, exhausting patrols. Convoy formations, once thought secure, were shattered by invisible attacks. The fear among merchant crews grew, every voyage a gamble, every sea a potential grave. Economists and strategists in Tokyo could see the consequences as clearly as naval officers. The flow of critical materials was slowing. Factories faced shortages of fuel. Rubber for tires and aircraft parts dwindled. Ships docked in port with empty holds. The supply lines that had seemed limitless now strained under constant assault. And yet, even as the Japanese Navy struggled to detect or counter the threat, they could not comprehend the full scope of the danger. The submarines weren't just sinking ships, they were rewriting the rules of naval warfare. They were small, unseen, and extraordinarily lethal, capable of striking anywhere and disappearing without a trace. The Empire's lifeline was unraveling, and for the first time, Japan began to realize that their greatest weapon might be a ghost, one they could not see, could not hear, and could not stop. But silence alone was not the submarine's only weapon. There was something else, something inherent in their very nature, that Japan never solved. A final edge that would turn the tide of the Pacific War. 1944. Across the vast Pacific, battles were fought not just with guns and torpedoes, but with information, and America had an invisible advantage. Behind the stealthy prow of every U.S. submarine lay not only engines and torpedoes, but the secrets of the Japanese Navy itself. American codebreakers, working tirelessly in dimly lit rooms thousands of miles away, had cracked the ciphers that carried Japan's operational plans. Systems like Magic and Ultra provided patrol captains with precise knowledge of convoy routes, schedules, and compositions. For Japanese commanders, the effect was terrifying. One moment a convoy sailed confidently, guarded by destroyers and escorts. The next, torpedoes ripped through ships before anyone had a chance to react. Depth charges fell uselessly into empty water. From Tokyo to the front lines, officers scrambled to understand how their meticulously planned operations were being so devastatingly disrupted. But the truth remained invisible. Japanese captains did not realize that American submarines were not acting at random. They were ambushing targets they already knew would appear. They were stalking the sea with foreknowledge, striking with a precision that seemed impossible. And yet, the Americans themselves were never seen until the attack struck. This combination, intelligence plus stealth, gave the U.S. Navy an edge that bordered on the supernatural. Convoys were never safe. Routes that had seemed secure were now deadly corridors. Even the most experienced Japanese officers began to whisper about ghost submarines that appeared out of nowhere, struck without warning, and vanished as if swallowed by the ocean itself. The psychological impact was profound. Confidence gave way to paranoia. Men who had once believed in the safety of formation now flinched at every wave, every sonar ping, every shadow beneath the hull. Patrols became nerve-wracking exercises in survival rather than missions of duty. For American submariners, the knowledge they carried, both of their own mechanics and of the enemy's movements, was empowering. They could plan, coordinate, and execute attacks with terrifying efficiency. Each sunk ship validated the combination of skill, technology, and intelligence that made them nearly invincible. Yet the effect was also cumulative. Over time, Japanese crews began to dread the sea itself. Their largest warships, their fast convoys, even their veteran sailors, none were immune. Every engagement reinforced the sense that the Americans were everywhere and nowhere, stalking them at will. And while Japanese forces attempted to counter these attacks with improved tactics, convoy adjustments, and patrols, they only heightened the perception of helplessness. The invisible edge of intelligence had turned every defensive effort into another layer of vulnerability. The American submarines were no longer just hunters. They were orchestrators of fear, unseen commanders of the ocean, striking where the enemy least expected. Still, Japan did not surrender. They tried to fight back, to adapt, to patch the holes in their defenses, but every effort only deepened the sense of inevitability, of doom, a quiet terror born of invisible enemies and relentless strategy. 1945. Desperation began to shape Japanese naval strategy. As the U.S. submarine threat intensified, Japan threw everything it had at stopping the silent killers beneath the waves. They built escort vessels, armed with depth charges and more powerful guns. They experimented with sonar improvements, hoping to detect even the faintest hint of a lurking submarine. Convoy formations were adjusted, routes changed, schedules shuffled, anything to stay one step ahead. On paper, it seemed like a reasonable approach. But in practice, it was too little, too late. The Japanese lacked radar capable of detecting surfaced submarines at night. Their escort doctrine was outdated, designed for small-scale reconnaissance rather than coordinated defense against stealthy predators. Communication among ships was slow and rigid, leaving gaps that submarines exploited with surgical precision. Eyewitness accounts tell a chilling story. Destroyer crews would drop depth charges in furious volleys, watching explosions ripple through the ocean. Yet when the smoke cleared, the American submarines had vanished. One Japanese officer later wrote of the experience with bitter resignation. "We could hear the explosions, see the water churn, yet the enemy was never there. They were like shadows in a dream, always present, yet unreachable." Convoys that had once seemed secure began to shrink, not because of bold strikes on warships, but because merchant vessels, oil tankers, and supply ships were being cut down relentlessly. Every lost shipment was a blow to Japan's war effort. By 1945, shortages of food, fuel, and raw materials were not just inconveniences. They were crippling the empire itself. Cities went hungry, factories slowed, and military operations faltered. Japan's attempts to adapt only revealed the magnitude of America's advantage. The combination of silent running, reliable torpedoes, wolf-pack tactics, and intelligence from code-breaking created a force that could not be countered by brute strength alone. The very innovations meant to protect Japanese convoys often made the losses worse, as crews overreacted to phantom contacts or misread sonar echoes. In these final years, American submarines had become more than just hunters. They were instruments of economic warfare, strategic precision strikes that targeted the very lifelines of an empire. The oceans themselves seemed to conspire with them, carrying away ships as if the sea had chosen sides. Japanese officers, trained to master the art of war, were forced into a humiliating truth. No matter how many escorts they built, no matter how many depth charges fell, no matter how many convoys they rerouted, the silent service of the United States Navy remained a force beyond comprehension. By war's end, they would admit what they had long feared but refused to name. American submarines were not just tools of destruction. They were ghosts, invisible, untouchable, and devastatingly effective. The ocean was their domain, and for Japan it had become a trap. And yet, the lessons of this silent war extended beyond the Pacific. Because the story of the submarine act of patience, innovation, and the power of the unseen carries truths about strategy, resilience, and hidden strength that remain relevant to this day. 45. The Pacific War was drawing to a close, but the echoes of an invisible battle beneath the waves would linger far longer. By the time Japan surrendered, the United States submarine force had wrought a transformation in naval warfare. Fewer than 300 boats, less than 2% of the U.S. Navy, had sunk more than half of Japan's merchant fleet. Oil tankers, freighters, troop transports, ships that carried the lifeblood of the empire were destroyed with ruthless efficiency. The legend of these submarines was cemented not just in tonnage, but in the way they operated, quietly, invisibly, relentlessly. Sailors dubbed them the Million-Ton Club, a grim nod to the extraordinary impact of boats that could slip into enemy waters without detection, strike, and vanish like ghosts. For Japanese officers, post-war testimony revealed a mix of awe and disbelief. They spoke of submarines moving silently beneath convoys, firing torpedoes that always seemed to find their mark, and disappearing before a single countermeasure could land. The psychological impact of this silent service was profound. Ships that once sailed with confidence now traversed the Pacific in fear, aware that any convoy could be destroyed without warning. Confidence in Japanese naval supremacy eroded with each patrol, each sinking, and each failed attempt to detect the elusive Americans. Men who had been trained to dominate the seas found themselves powerless against an enemy they could not hear, could not see, and could not anticipate. For the Americans, the lessons went far beyond tonnage counts. Submarine commanders learned the value of patience, ingenuity, and discipline. They mastered the art of moving unseen, of striking with precision, and of exploiting intelligence to maximize impact. They demonstrated that the most important advantage in war is often the one you cannot see, a lesson as applicable in the Pacific as it is in any arena of strategy or human endeavor. In the end, the success of the U.S. submarine force was a combination of innovation, perseverance, and relentless adaptation. Torpedoes were fixed, tactics refined, crews trained to perfection. Intelligence from Magic and Ultra provided the roadmap, but it was the men aboard those submarines, vigilant, patient, daring, who executed it with deadly artistry. Their silence became their signature, their greatest weapon, and their enduring legacy. Historians often reflect that the Pacific War could have turned out very differently if not for these unseen hunters. Surface fleets, aircraft carriers, and battleships dominated headlines, but it was the quiet, methodical work of the submarine force that choked the supply lines, drained the economy, and hastened the end of the empire. The ocean itself became a theater of silent terror, where skill, stealth, and strategy mattered more than firepower alone. And for the Japanese captains, there was a bitter truth. No amount of training, courage, or technology could compensate for what they could not perceive. They couldn't hear them. And by the time they realized what was happening, it was already too late. The legacy of the silent service is more than history. It is a lesson in resilience, ingenuity, and the unseen forces that shape outcomes. In war, in life, and in strategy, those who move carefully, quietly, and deliberately can wield power far beyond what is visible to others. The submarine crews of the Pacific understood this instinctively, and in their quiet, invisible way, they changed the course of the war. The ocean was silent. The hunters were patient, and the world would never forget the ghostly shadows that emerged from the deep.